What if everything you believed about justice was a lie? What if the very people who claimed to protect democracy were the ones quietly dismantling it, brick by brick? Washington, D.C. had seen its fair share of scandals. But this was different. It wasn't just another partisan skirmish clogging up the news cycle. This was the moment where rhetoric met reality, where one of the most powerful voices in progressive politics faced something she couldn't filibuster, deflect, or tweet her way out of. The truth. It all started, as these things often do, with a leak. A simple document passed through the right hands, whispered into the right ears. Then came the headlines, screaming in all caps across the media landscape like sirens before a storm. AOC under fire. Allegations of aiding illegal immigrants. Biggest hearing of the year, Tom Homan versus AOC. Within hours, social media became a digital coliseum where supporters and critics clashed in an endless war of outrage. And now here they were, the U.S. Capitol, swarming with reporters. Their cameras poised like loaded weapons, waiting to capture the moment Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked into a room that could decide the fate of her political career. To some, she was a fearless champion of the oppressed. To others, the ultimate political opportunist. Today, the world would see which one she truly was. On the other side of this battle stood Tom Homan, a man who had spent a lifetime in the trenches of immigration enforcement. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't here for sound bites or viral clips. He was here for one reason: to expose the truth. And if that truth led to the downfall of one of the Democratic Party's rising stars, so be it. AOC stepped out of her black SUV with a practiced ease that only comes from knowing the cameras are always rolling. Flashbulbs erupted around her, reporters shouting her name, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony of scandal and speculation. She waved, flashed a confident smile, an expression honed through years of political theater. But confidence is easy in front of a cheering rally. It's a lot harder when you're walking into a room full of people who smell blood in the water. Inside, Homan sat, watching the doors, waiting. His expression was unreadable, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had already won. Unlike AOC, he wasn't here to perform. He was here to dismantle an argument, to cut through the noise and theatrics and remind everyone that laws still mattered, even if some politicians believed they were above them. But this wasn't just about AOC anymore. The whispers had already begun. Was she acting alone? Or was this part of something bigger? A carefully orchestrated strategy? A coordinated effort behind closed doors? If one member of Congress had been actively undermining immigration law, how deep did it go? Who else knew? Who else was complicit? These weren't just political questions, they were legal ones. And if today's hearing didn't go her way, AOC wouldn't just be fighting for her career. She'd be fighting to stay out of a courtroom. So here we were, the battle lines drawn. One of Washington's most combative progressives was about to meet one of law enforcement's toughest enforcers. And in a city built on power and deception, the only real question was, who was about to be exposed? Inside, the Capitol hearing room, the air was thick with tension. Rows of lawmakers sat poised, their expressions ranging from calculated indifference to barely concealed anticipation. Reporters lined the back wall, fingers hovering over keyboards, ready to document history as it unfolded, because today, justice, real justice, was on trial. Every syllable, every pause, every flicker of expression, captured and analyzed, ready to be etched into the annals of political history. The air was thick with anticipation, not just for another partisan showdown, but for a reckoning. At the center of it all, Tom Homan leaned forward in his chair, surveying the room like a battlefield before the first shot was fired. He wasn't here for theatrics. He wasn't here for the political grandstanding that often turned these hearings into spectacle. He was here for one reason: to deliver a cold, hard reality check. His voice was steady, measured, carrying the weight of a man who had spent a lifetime enforcing laws, not just debating them. We're not just talking about a sitting congresswoman bending the law, he began, his words slicing through the murmurs like a blade. We're talking about an elected official actively assisting illegal immigrants in evading federal law enforcement. The statement hit like a hammer. Even those accustomed to Washington's relentless political theater straightened in their seats. Across the table, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez remained still, her posture composed. The cameras caught her expression, cool, unbothered. But the sharp inhale she took before Homan spoke was impossible to miss. Homan wasn't done. Reaching into the folder before him, he lifted a single sheet of paper, holding it up for the room to see. The text was bold, the language unmistakable. Spanish. The murmurs in the chamber swelled. If Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez was merely educating her constituents, Homan continued, tilting his head slightly, then why does this pamphlet instruct them on how to evade ICE? The question hung in the air like a guillotine. Why would legal citizens need to be told how to avoid deportation? Why would they need to know how to refuse entry to federal agents? Why does this pamphlet exist at all? A ripple of tension spread through the room, a calculated pause, one that forced the opposition to either sit in silence or scramble for a defense. Across from him, AOC's hands remained clasped, her knuckles tightening ever so slightly. This wasn't Twitter. This wasn't a friendly news segment where she could steer the conversation. Here there was no edit button. Homan leaned back slightly, his tone cool but unrelenting. If this is about protecting constitutional rights, then tell me. He lifted the paper higher. Who exactly were you protecting, Congresswoman? The cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment with merciless precision. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, heavy with the kind of energy that could alter the trajectory of a political career. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wasn't about to sit back and be turned into a political trophy. If they wanted a spectacle, she'd give them one. Her hand slammed into the microphone, not in frustration, but as a deliberate cue, a drum roll for what was coming next. A signal to the cameras. The headlines were waiting to be written, and she wasn't about to waste a second of primetime exposure. This is a political witch hunt, she thundered, her voice slicing through the chamber like a megaphone at a protest. They don't care about justice. They don't care about facts. This is about silencing me. Silencing all of us who dare to stand up for the vulnerable. She turned to Homan now, locking eyes with him like a missile locked onto its target. Theatrics were over. Now came the performance. Tell me, Mr. Homan, she said, her tone laced with incredulity. How many times have you been dragged into this chamber and forced to defend your own actions? How many families have been torn apart because of the policies you enforce? A murmur rippled through the room. The battle had only just begun. The reversal was classic. A textbook maneuver. Take the attack, pivot, and throw it back. A challenge disguised as a question. Homan didn't blink. He had spent decades dealing with criminals who thought they could outmaneuver federal agents. He wasn't about to get rattled by a congresswoman whose idea of a crisis was a bad Twitter ratio. I enforce the law, Congresswoman. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like a blade pressing just enough to break skin. I don't make the rules. I follow them. Something you apparently have a problem with. A low rumble of reaction rippled through the room. AOC leaned forward, her expression a mix of disbelief and disgust. The look of someone who had just spotted hypocrisy and was about to drag it into the light. Follow the rules? She echoed, eyes narrowing. That's interesting because last time I checked, ICE wasn't exactly known for its humanitarian track record. Would you call separating children from their parents just following orders, Mr. Homan? The trap was set. And she knew it. The words, just following orders, were radioactive. The media would seize on them in minutes. Headlines would explode. Parallels to the darkest chapters of history. Outrage flooding every news cycle. But Homan wasn't here to play word games. He was here to fight with facts. Let's be very clear, he said, his voice steady. If parents don't want to be separated from their children, they shouldn't cross the border illegally. That's the law. The same law you swore an oath to uphold. A direct hit. For a beat, the weight of it hung in the air. just long enough for everyone to register that this wasn't just ideology anymore. This was personal. AOC's jaw tensed. Her fingers tightened against the desk. But before she could fire back, the real battle had already spilled outside the chamber. Within seconds, the media machine roared to life. AOC shuts down ICE director with powerful rebuke. Homan defends family separations in heated exchange. Tensions explode as AOC confronts Trump-era policies. Homan knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't a hearing. This was a script. And AOC was making damn sure she was the one writing it. "Tell me, Mr. Homan," she said, her voice dripping with mock patience. "Since you seem to believe in the law so much, let's talk about what happens when a sitting member of Congress is accused of aiding and abetting illegal immigration. What's the penalty for that?" That did it. The chamber erupted. Reporters scrambled. Cameras zoomed in. Committee members shifted in their seats. Now, it wasn't just about policy. It was about whether AOC had just dared him to call for her prosecution on live television. There were moments in politics that felt rehearsed, predictable, manufactured for cable news consumption. And then there were moments like this, unscripted, volatile, carrying the distinct scent of a career-altering disaster. A paper hovered in the air like a blade, its significance rippling through the room before a single word had been spoken. The press had their shot, the cameras had their focus, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had a problem. The Republican senator holding the letter didn't rush. He knew the art of the slow kill. His fingers adjusted slightly on the document, just enough to let the fluorescent light catch the embossed congressional seal at the top. Then, with the ease of a man completely in control, he finally spoke. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, perhaps you can shed some light on this." The paper landed on the desk with a soft but deafening finality. Not loud, but heavy. AOC's shoulders tensed, barely, but enough, and the game had just changed. She didn't pick up the letter. Not yet. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what it was. A plea. Not a defense. Not a justification. A plea. The letter she had sent to Pam Bondi, now sitting between them, tangible and undeniable. Her own words, no longer just rhetoric but evidence. Tom Homan didn't move. He didn't need to. He had spent a lifetime watching people realize they were out of moves, and that split-second pause before the performance kicked in told him everything he needed to know. Curious, isn't it? His voice sliced through the silence. Someone who claims they've done nothing wrong, scrambling for protection. A murmur rippled through the room. AOC's jaw tightened, but when she spoke, her voice was steady, controlled. "This is a baseless smear campaign," she countered. "An attempt to weaponize the legal system against a sitting member of Congress simply because I refuse to stand by while human rights are trampled." The words came fast, sharp, each syllable designed for the cameras, for the social media clips that would flood timelines within minutes. But Homan wasn't playing for optics. He was playing for facts, and facts had a nasty way of refusing to bend. "Is that what this is?" Homan asked, his tone almost bored. He tapped the letter once, the sound small but deafening, because this doesn't look like someone taking a principled stand. This looks like someone who realized they crossed the line and panicked. The hit landed. AOC's fingers tightened against the desk, her knuckles whitening before she forced herself to relax. She had prepared for attacks, on her character, on her policies, on her progressive agenda. But this wasn't an attack. This was a fact, and facts weren't so easily spun. "Mr. Homan," she said, her voice shifting, controlled but biting. "I understand that fear-mongering is your forte. You built your career terrorizing vulnerable communities. You stand for an institution that rips children from their parents, that separates families with zero accountability. And now you sit here, lecturing me, the pivot, the attack, the classic strategy. She wasn't playing defense anymore. She was on the offensive." Homan knew how this worked. The real battle wasn't in this room. It was out there, in the spin, in the headlines, in the selective clips and viral moments that would be cut, edited, and spread before he even left his seat. But he also knew something else. He wasn't the one on trial. "Tell yourself whatever you need to, Congresswoman," Homan said, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "But that letter?" He tapped it again. "That's not politics. That's not spin. That's evidence." AOC hated that word, evidence, because evidence could do what no tweet, no speech, no viral moment ever could. It could stick. And for the first time that day, she looked like she knew it. The air in the chamber thickened into something dense, electric, volatile, the kind of atmosphere where careers were either forged in fire or reduced to ash. At the center of it all sat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a woman who had built an empire on words, on passion, on the unshakable conviction that she was always the victim, never the villain. But conviction was a fragile thing when held up against the cold, immutable weight of the law. She slammed her palm against the table. The sharp crack reverberated across the chamber. The movement was dramatic, deliberate, meant for the cameras, for the sound bites, for the progressive warriors sitting at home, waiting to turn this hearing into yet another war cry. "Speak," she declared, her voice thick with manufactured outrage, her eyes glistening just enough to suggest a woman on the brink, but not too much. No, this was precisely calculated political theater, the kind designed to stir sympathy without making her look weak. "This is about silencing me. This is about silencing a Latina woman who dares to challenge the system." The script? Flawless. The delivery? Oscar-worthy. But unfortunately for her, Tom Homan wasn't the audience. He wasn't impressed. He had sat across from cartel enforcers who lied better, human traffickers who begged harder, criminals who had tried and failed to manipulate the law to their advantage. And this was just bad acting. He leaned forward, his gaze slicing through her performance like a scalpel. "Spare me the monologue, Congresswoman." The words landed with a weight that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with finality. He let them settle, deliberately unchallenged for a fraction of a second, letting the reality sink in. Her usual tactics weren't working. Then, in a voice as sharp as steel and just as unforgiving, he continued, "I don't care who you are. I don't care how many retweets you get, how many magazine covers you grace, or how many times you cry persecution when someone holds you accountable. Mio." Let that sink in. Then the final blow. "What I care about him is the law. Checkmate. Her name, her identity, her self-crafted image as the progressive David to the conservative Goliath. None of it mattered here, because facts didn't care about political theater." Homan tapped a finger against the infamous letter sitting between them, his tone cool, unbothered. The voice of a man who had walked through fire so many times he no longer smelled the smoke. "You can wrap yourself in whatever identity politics you like. You can frame this however best suits your next campaign video. But at the end of the day, the law isn't interested in what you feel. The law is only interested in what you did." No applause. No dramatic gasps. This wasn't a rally. But the silence that followed? It was louder than any protest chant AOC had ever led. The committee room had been a battlefield since the moment the hearing began. But now, it was something else entirely. This was an execution, and Tom Homan was about to pull the trigger. Then, a ping. One of those digital alerts that, under normal circumstances, would have gone unnoticed amid the clatter of reporters typing, cameras flashing, and political egos colliding. But this wasn't a normal moment. A screen flickered to life at the back of the room, and suddenly everything changed. "Wait, what's that?" one of the committee members muttered, squinting at their tablet. "Oh my God," a reporter whispered under her breath. And then, like wildfire, it spread. Phones buzzing, staffers whispering, chairs creaking as members of Congress leaned forward in their seats. Because there it was, a video, fresh off the internet, spreading across every major news outlet like gasoline meeting an open flame. And at the center of the screen, in undeniable clarity, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez raw. Unfiltered, caught in a private meeting, her voice clear, her intent unmistakable. "We need to help them avoid getting caught by ICE. It's the only way." A sound rippled through the room, something not quite a gasp, but not far from it. AOC froze. Her eyes flicked to the screen, to the damning footage playing out in real time. And, for the first time all day, she didn't look like the crusading champion of the oppressed. She didn't look like the defiant warrior standing against the system. She looked like something else entirely. She looked caught. She looked like someone who had just been caught. The video kept playing, but no one was really listening anymore. The damage was done. AOC's own words, her voice clear and irrefutable, hung in the air like a confession broadcast to the world. It wasn't taken out of context. It wasn't doctored. It wasn't a conservative smear job. It was her, saying the quiet part out loud. Across the table, Tom Homan sat perfectly still, watching her the way a seasoned hunter watches an animal realize, too late, that it has stepped into a snare. Maduri, committee room wasn't silent, far from it. Reporters murmured frantically into their phones. Congressional aides whispered in urgent tones. The furious clatter of keyboards filled the air, but at the center of it all, between the two key players, there was only the slow, suffocating weight of reality settling in. Then, Homan broke the tension. He exhaled, not quite a laugh, but something dangerously close to it, a sound of recognition. So, there it is. His voice was calm, the kind of calm that comes when the argument is already won. AOC gritted her teeth, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face before she forced every ounce of righteous fury into her words. "This is a coordinated attack," she snapped, her voice edged with defiance and something far less stable. "You people have been out to destroy me from the start. This entire hearing is a joke." Homan tilted his head slightly, as if genuinely curious. "A joke?" he repeated, his voice slow, deliberate. "You think it's a joke that a sitting member of Congress is caught on tape coaching people on how to break the law?" "I was protecting vulnerable communities," she shot back. "Vulnerable communities?" He arched a brow. "That's interesting, because the last time I checked, aiding and abetting illegal activity wasn't called protection. It was called a federal offense." AOC's fingers curled against the table. Before she could fire back, he continued, each word landing with lethal precision. "Let's get something straight, Congresswoman." He leaned forward now, lowering his voice just enough to turn the statement into a razor's edge. "No one is stopping law-abiding immigrants from living the American dream. What we are stopping is people who break the law, and the politicians who think they can rewrite the rules to fit their own agenda." A few committee members shifted in their seats. Because this wasn't just about AOC anymore. The implications were far bigger than her political career. But she wasn't done. Not yet. "You act like ICE doesn't commit human rights abuses daily," she snapped, her voice rising. "Like this country hasn't built a system designed to criminalize people seeking a better life." Homan cut in, his voice steady. "Spare me the lecture. Not unkind, just unimpressed. You want to talk about a better life? Tell that to the families of Americans killed by criminal illegal aliens your policies shield. Tell that to the border agents overwhelmed by the chaos politicians like you create, from the safety of their DC offices." AOC's lips parted, but Homan wasn't finished. "And let's not pretend this was some grand humanitarian mission. You weren't just advocating for immigrant rights. You were instructing people on how to evade federal law enforcement. You made yourself a shield for lawbreakers. And now you want to cry foul because someone is finally holding you accountable." The words hit like a wrecking ball, because they were true. What had started as a political spectacle, a tug-of-war between ideologies, had become something else entirely. Now, it was a legal disaster spiraling out of her control. And the worst part? She knew it. The chair at the end of the table scraped against the floor, slow, deliberate. A representative from the Department of Justice stood. The room, chaotic just seconds ago, seemed to contract, caught in a moment of collective stillness before the mob hammer fell. We are officially opening an investigation into Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The words landed with the force of a guillotine blade. AOC went rigid, her mouth parting as if to protest, to summon one last defense, one final rallying cry to her supporters, to the media, to anyone still willing to listen. But nothing came out. Because what was left to say? She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a suspect, and for the first time, there was no escape. The inevitable political downfall. Predictable, yet so exquisitely entertaining. Especially when the architect of their own ruin is someone who built their career on righteous indignation and insufferable self-righteousness. AOC had always thrived on outrage, basking in the glow of a devoted fan base that would excuse anything, so long as it was wrapped in a progressive slogan and delivered with enough performative passion. But outrage is a fickle currency, and when the same tactics you once used to crucify your enemies are suddenly turned against you, well, the results are nothing short of poetic. The fallout from her disastrous congressional hearing was instantaneous. News outlets, some begrudgingly, others with barely concealed glee, plastered their front pages with headlines that would make even the most seasoned political strategist break into a cold sweat. AOC's career on the brink. Did she go too far? Ocasio-Cortez under fire. Could criminal charges be next? Progressive darling or lawbreaker, the nation debates. It was the kind of media circus that AOC usually thrived in, except this time she wasn't the ringmaster. She was the main attraction, and no amount of teary-eyed rhetoric or impassioned social media rants could undo what the cameras had already captured. And speaking of social media, oh, what a beautiful disaster it was. For years, AOC wielded Twitter like a digital flamethrower, incinerating opponents with self-righteous tweets and overused GIFs. But this time Twitter wasn't her friend. The hashtags alone were enough to make any publicist consider early retirement. AOC for prison. Simple, direct, brutally effective. Deport AOC. A bit dramatic, but the sentiment was clear. Lock her up. Because, well, turnabout is fair play, isn't it? The internet wasn't just angry, it was relentless. Memes flooded in by the thousands. Clips of her disastrous testimony were edited into mock campaign ads, mocking her inevitable 2024 Save Myself from Prison tour, and the damning video, the one where she was caught on tape admitting to helping illegal immigrants evade ICE. That one had already been remixed into half a dozen parody videos, including one particularly brutal version featuring the Curb Your Enthusiasm theme. Then came the protests. Cities that had long suffered under reckless immigration policies erupted in fury. Texas, ground zero for the border crisis. Communities that had borne the brunt of political negligence finally had enough. Their voices roared through the streets. Florida, a state that never tolerates political grandstanding. Protesters demanded action against politicians who thought they were above the law. Arizona, a state that knows firsthand what happens when elected officials play fast and loose with border security. The marches were loud, the anger palpable, and then the real kicker, the reaction from within her own party. Once the golden child of the progressive movement, AOC now found herself dangling from a political cliff, her grip on party support slipping by the second. The moderates, who had long tolerated her antics but never truly embraced her, were suddenly nowhere to be found. The silence was deafening. Democratic leadership had nothing to say. Because here's the ugly truth about politics. Loyalty lasts only as long as you are useful. And right now, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was looking less like an asset and more like a liability. The question wasn't whether her career would survive this scandal. The question was, who would be the first in her own party to throw her under the bus? Because in Washington, there's an unspoken rule. If you become more trouble than you're worth, you cease to exist, at least politically. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she had just become the biggest liability in the Democratic Party. Behind closed doors, the private conference rooms where real power is wielded, not on social media, not in carefully curated interviews, But in the smoke-filled back rooms where careers are quietly ended, that's where Democratic leaders gathered to discuss one thing, and one thing only. What the hell to do about AOC? The walls were thick, but not thick enough to contain the rage, simmering inside. She's taking us all down with her. One senior Democrat spat, slamming his fist on the polished table. We are months away from an election, and instead of controlling the narrative, we're defending a lunatic who just handed the Republicans an easy victory. Across the table, the progressive wing of the party bristled. She was targeted, one of her staunchest allies argued. This is a right-wing smear campaign designed to silence the most important voice in progressive politics. Important voice? A moderate sneered. She just went on live television and admitted to breaking the law. That's not a voice. That's a confession. The tension crackled. AOC had always been a problem, but before she had been a useful one. The party had tolerated her antics, her Twitter rants, her tax the rich slogan while wearing a $30,000 dress to the Met Gala, because at the end of the day she brought in votes, energy, and fundraising dollars. But now she was bleeding out politically, and the only question left was, would the party try to save her? Or would they leave her to drown, cutting her loose? The moderates already knew their answer. We need to cut her loose, one of them said flatly. If we don't, she'll take us down with her. A chill settled over the room. Because saying it out loud, that was the first step toward actually making it happen. AOC's campaign team had already begun sounding the alarms. Phone calls were going unanswered. Meetings were being canceled. The donors who once lined up to throw money at her campaign were now suddenly busy, very busy, as they reevaluated whether their millions were better spent on someone with a future. The numbers were brutal. Before the scandal, AOC was riding at 58% approval. Not rock solid, but enough to make re-election a given. Now, 28% approval. 60% disapproval. This wasn't damage control territory. This was ejection seat territory. And it wasn't just that voters were angry. They were embarrassed. She had been their symbol, their warrior, the one who took on the system. But now, she was just another politician caught red-handed, desperately spinning, blaming everyone but herself. As the walls closed in, the final nail in the coffin, the biggest donors pulled the plug first. No dramatic statements, no big announcements, just a slow, deliberate retreat. The kind that happens when people know a sinking ship isn't worth rescuing. Her campaign was already hemorrhaging funds. But with the big money donors gone, reality set in. AOC might not even have the cash to run a competitive race. And that was the final nail in the coffin. The Democratic Party had a choice to make: double down and go down with her, or cut their losses and move on. And in Washington, when survival is on the line, loyalty is the first thing to go.